The last number Hannah Prescott ever expected to define her life was a round, desperate one: $1,000. That was all that remained in her bank account the morning she sat in the cramped corner of her cousin's kitchen, her laptop glowing cold and judgmental in front of her. It had taken 6 months of rejection letters, substitute gigs that paid in gas money, and the slow erosion of pride for her to land at this moment, staring at a listing for an abandoned farmhouse up for county auction in Doylestown, Ohio. Minimum bid, $1,000. She sipped a mug of weak instant coffee, legs pulled to her chest, while her son, Lucas, still snored softly on the air mattress in the guest room. Just 9 years old, he didn't need to know how close they were to running out of options. He didn't see the collection notices that arrived every week, or hear the tightness in his mom's voice when she said, "We're just waiting on something to come through." To him, this was just another adventure. To Hannah, it was the edge of a cliff. The listing was simple. No pictures, just a description. 2-story farmhouse, built 1904, structural wear. Needs full rehab, former Whitlow property, seized for tax delinquency. Sold as is. She remembered the name Whitlow. As a girl, she'd heard stories about that family, something about politics, maybe the military. The house had always been there, nestled at the edge of County Road 191, half swallowed by trees and weeds. Kids at school used to say it was haunted, that it gave off a kind of quiet you could feel in your bones. And now, for the price of everything she had left, it could be hers. It was madness. But so was staying still. She clicked bid now. The next morning was cloudy and cold, the kind of gray that made everything look like an old photograph. Hannah and Lucas stood in front of the property, their belongings packed in the trunk of her aging Subaru. She stared up at the house, her breath catching in her throat. It looked exactly as she remembered, except smaller, less haunted maybe. Or maybe she just didn't have the luxury of superstition anymore. The porch sagged under its own weight. Shingles were missing like teeth from the roof. The front door hung slightly ajar, and the yard was a tangle of dead grass and stubborn weeds. A rusted mailbox still bore the name Whitlow in faded lettering. "Is it really ours?" Lucas asked, wide-eyed. Hannah reached down, squeezed his hand. "Yeah, kiddo. Ours." They crossed the yard, crunching gravel underfoot. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Wallpaper peeled in long curls. A grandfather clock stood motionless in the corner, its face stuck at 4:11. The kitchen, where the auction paperwork said a fire had once started, smelled faintly of soot. But it was solid, and it was theirs. Lucas dashed from room to room with the excitement only a child could muster. Hannah followed more cautiously, noting cracked beams, sagging floors, water damage near the rear windows. Every creak underfoot reminded her that the $1,000 hadn't bought comfort. It had bought possibility, a fragile kind. She didn't notice the odd floorboard in the kitchen until she dropped a broom and heard a sharp clack. Hollow, not solid. She froze, bent down. One plank near the old stove had shifted slightly, revealing a seam that didn't match the others. Curious, she pressed her fingers along the edge. It didn't give. "Huh," she murmured, filing the thought away. Maybe just age, maybe not. That night, they unrolled sleeping bags in the front room and heated soup on a camp stove. Lucas fell asleep with a flashlight in one hand. The beam pointed toward the ceiling, where water stains made strange patterns in the plaster. Hannah couldn't sleep. Her mind buzzed with repairs, paperwork, and the uncertainty of what came next. Sometime near midnight, restless, she climbed to the attic. The staircase groaned under her weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell changed, less like rot, more like mothballs and dust. The attic door stuck, then gave way with a shuddering creak. Inside, moonlight poured through a cracked pane, illuminating boxes, furniture covered in sheets, and cobwebs strung like banners between rafters. Hannah moved slowly, brushing dust from surfaces with her sleeves. She felt like an intruder in someone else's forgotten life. Near the far wall, beneath a low eave, she spotted an old suitcase. It was canvas, frayed at the edges, with a faded tag that read, M. Whitlow. Heart thumping, she knelt and clicked it open. Inside was a small cloth pouch, stiff with age. She unfolded it gently, revealing a tarnished metal badge stamped with an eagle and shield. The White House, 1968. Below it, a name, Margaret Whitlow. Beside the badge was a stack of envelopes bound with brittle string. The paper was yellowed, the ink barely legible in places. The top envelope was sealed. On the front, "For Eleanor, in case I don't come back." Hannah sat frozen for several long minutes, the quiet pressing in on her. Who was Margaret Whitlow? Why had she left a White House badge in an attic in rural Ohio? And what did she mean by, "in case I don't come back"? She clutched the envelope, her fingers trembling. History had always been her anchor. It made sense of the world when life didn't. And here, in the attic of a broken-down farmhouse bought on a whim, history had reached back out to her, cold, buried, and whispering. She turned to leave, envelope in hand, unaware that in the distance, parked along the county road beneath a canopy of trees, a black SUV had quietly pulled to a stop. Its engine idled, its lights stayed off, and someone inside began taking notes. The attic was stifling that afternoon. Dusty air thick with insulation particles and the scent of sun-warmed cedar planks. Hannah stood crouched under one of the low beams, holding her phone's flashlight with one hand and the faded canvas bag in the other. The badge still sat heavily in her palm, its golden trim dull but unmistakable. The White House, 1968. Next to it, the bundle of unopened letters was secured by a brittle blue ribbon. Curiosity bloomed into something deeper, an unease, a whisper of history echoing louder than it had in years. Back downstairs, she carefully laid everything on the kitchen counter. Lucas had gone off to explore the barn, giving her a rare moment alone. She undid the ribbon. The paper crackled like autumn leaves, each envelope addressed in the same looping handwriting, Margaret Whitlow, 1256 Vernon Street, Washington, D.C. The return address was government-issued, Department of Executive Administration, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. One of the letters was not sealed, but folded closed around a small object, a key. Beneath it, tucked between the folds, was a leather-bound journal, stiff with age, but remarkably well-preserved. On the inside cover, inked in elegant cursive, was a name that brought everything into terrifying focus. Margaret E. Whitlow, Executive Stenographer, White House, 1966 to 1968. Hannah's heart pounded. The name Whitlow had rung faint bells since the auction, but this was confirmation. Margaret wasn't just a name etched into old property records. She had worked inside the White House at the height of the Cold War and the Vietnam conflict. And now, decades later, her personal writings had resurfaced in Hannah's crumbling kitchen. She sat down, drew in a slow breath, and began to read. January 11th, 1967. First full day at the White House. The corridors feel heavy, like the walls are watching. I typed for Secretary Clifford today. He's polite but guarded. Everyone is guarded, except for President Johnson. He nodded at me in passing. I nearly fainted. The entries began innocuously enough. Routine tasks, meetings, coffee breaks, jokes with other clerks. But as she turned the pages, the tone darkened. February 27th, 1967. Today I transcribed a meeting between McNamara, Rusk, and the president. It wasn't supposed to be recorded. I kept a personal copy. God forgive me. March 14th, 1967. McNamara asked for adjusted language in reports going to the press. We're rewriting truth now. I'm just a secretary, but I can't unhear what I've heard. Hannah closed the journal briefly, pressing it to her chest. Her instincts were screaming. This wasn't some family scrapbook. Margaret had recorded details of closed-door meetings that should have remained confidential forever. She was bearing witness to an unraveling, and doing so with the quiet bravery of someone who knew the risk. Flipping deeper into the journal, the entries grew more chaotic. Short bursts of paranoia and tension interspersed with accounts of what sounded like covert surveillance. July 8th, 1967. They searched my desk. I'm sure of it. The folder I hid behind the divider is gone. I told no one. They must suspect. August 23rd, 1967. They're discussing Tonkin again, how it's all posturing now, no new intel, just theater. My stomach turns every time I type enemy aggression. Hannah leaned back in her chair. Tonkin couldn't mean anything other than the Gulf of Tonkin incident, one of the most contested military escalations in U.S. history. Had Margaret been in the room during the strategy sessions that built the case for war? Another entry leapt out at her. October 10th, 1967. There's talk of tapes, hidden microphones, not the official ones, the ones no one admits exist. I found a way to record them. I don't know what compels me, but history is being lied to in real time. Beneath this was a jagged line, as if the pen had been jerked across the page. Then one final entry, months later. November 16th, 1968. They found the duplicate. I know it. The door was ajar when I came back from lunch. They've been polite, but cold. Like they already decided. I can't stay. The truth is buried under the bell, where no one will think to look. God help me. I only ever wanted history, to be honest. Hannah sat stunned, staring at the line. The truth is buried under the bell, where no one will think to look. She whispered the words aloud. Under the bell. Was it a metaphor, a reference to liberty, or something literal? An old dinner bell, a church bell? She stood slowly and looked out the kitchen window at the overgrown yard, now cast in long, golden shadows. Something about the phrase stuck with her. She could feel Margaret's urgency bleeding off the page. A breeze stirred the faded curtains. Hannah clutched the journal tighter. This wasn't just forgotten history. This was a confession, a buried record of truth, penned by someone who had witnessed deceit from the front row of history's darkest performances. A woman whose name had long been erased from polite records, now whispering from beyond decades. Find it. Hannah set the journal down gently. Then she walked to the dusty built-in hutch at the edge of the dining room and pulled open the drawer where she'd placed the White House badge. Margaret's photo was small, tucked in the corner of the card, but unmistakable. Her features were delicate but sharp, her expression distant and resolved. Hannah blinked. There was something familiar there, something in the jawline, the curve of the brow. She pulled her phone out, opened the selfie camera, and placed it beside the ID. A chill ran down her spine. They could have been sisters. No, more like aunt and niece. Maybe great-aunt. Maybe something else. The resemblance was unmistakable. Her breath hitched. "Who are you to me?" she whispered. She didn't have answers yet, but Margaret Whitlow hadn't disappeared. She'd left breadcrumbs, deliberate ones, and Hannah Prescott, out of sheer desperation and a $1,000 gamble, had stumbled onto them. Her history teacher instincts flared into something more, something personal. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about finishing what Margaret had started. The day had started like any other since Hannah moved into the farmhouse, cold, damp, and laced with the faint smell of rotting wood and memories she didn't yet understand. She was in the kitchen, on her knees with a crowbar in one hand and a utility knife in the other, trying to strip away decades of cracked linoleum. Lucas sat nearby on an overturned milk crate, munching on dry cereal from the box, and watching her with the innocent boredom of a 9-year-old with nowhere else to be. "Mom, this floor sounds weird," Lucas suddenly said, tapping his sneaker against a discolored wooden plank. Hannah looked up, brows furrowing. "What do you mean, weird?" Lucas leaned forward, knocked on the floor with his knuckles, then again 2 inches to the left. "Here it sounds solid, but here." He knocked once more. A hollow thud echoed through the quiet house. Hannah froze. That sound didn't belong. She crawled over beside him and rapped on the board herself. Once, twice. The second tap resonated low and empty, like a drum buried beneath the earth. Her heart started to pound, not in fear exactly, but in the same way it had as a teenager when she'd first cracked open her grandfather's old war letters and realized they weren't just stories. She reached for the edge of the plank and ran her fingers along the seam. It moved. "Lucas, hand me that flathead," she said, her voice low and steady. With one swift motion, Hannah pried the board up. Dust and a few dead beetles scattered across the floor, and beneath the plank lay a narrow rectangular cavity. Nestled inside was a box, steel, heavy-looking, and caked with rust on the hinges. It was about the size of a shoebox, but deeper, with a locking mechanism made up of a simple 3-dial code. "Is it a treasure box?" Lucas whispered, his voice caught somewhere between excitement and awe. Maybe, Hannah replied, but her tone had turned cautious. She could feel the tension tightening in her shoulders. It wasn't just a box. It was hidden well. And that always meant one thing. Someone didn't want it found. She lifted it out with effort. It was heavier than she expected. The bottom had small ventilation holes. A musty, metallic smell clung to it like the scent of secrets. She placed it gently on the kitchen table, careful not to disturb the dials. "Should we open it?" Lucas asked. "We will," she said, reaching for her laptop. "But not before we figure out what it might be." While Lucas watched cartoons on her phone, Hannah sat at the table, box in front of her, searching online for any clues. The box didn't match any commercial lockboxes she could find. It looked government-issued, military maybe, industrial. She tried a few combinations, 000-911-177, but nothing clicked. As the afternoon light waned and shadows began to stretch across the kitchen floor, she decided to take a different route. Back up in the attic, where she'd found the badge and letters, she scoured through the bag again. The badge read, Margaret Whitlow, Executive Secretary, White House Access Level 4, with a date printed faintly at the bottom corner, 6668. That was it. Hannah raced back downstairs, dialed the box to 668. A soft click echoed in the stillness of the kitchen. She inhaled sharply, hands suddenly damp with sweat. The lid creaked as she opened it. Inside lay 3 reel-to-reel audio tapes, nestled in foam padding, and a manila folder stamped in fading red. Eyes only, confidential. The tape reels had labels scrawled in faded pen. March 3rd, 1967, Oval Office. May 9th, 1967, OP Plan Discussion. July 14th, 1967, 1967. Gulf Strategy Brief. Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder. Inside was a single document, yellowed with age, but still legible. The heading read, Strategic Disinformation Proposal, Gulf of Tonkin Engagement Expansion. Hannah leaned back in the chair, unable to speak for a moment. She had taught high school students about the Vietnam War, about the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident. She remembered repeating the textbook lines, that it had justified America's full-scale entry into the war. But she also remembered the theories, the whispers in academic circles that the incident had been misrepresented or outright fabricated. And now she was staring at a document that, if genuine, proved the worst of those suspicions. A sudden chill crept over her. This wasn't just history. This was classified, possibly still classified, and she had it, sitting open on a kitchen table next to a box of cereal and her son's Spider-Man mug. She grabbed her laptop again and began researching federal statutes. Her heart sank as she read the regulations about the unauthorized possession of classified materials. Even if the materials were over 50 years old, some of the laws didn't specify expiration. The words national security breach and federal offense leapt off the screen. She ran a hand through her hair, forcing herself to breathe. If Margaret Whitlow had hidden these tapes, she had done so for a reason. And if the government hadn't retrieved them after all this time, it was likely because no one knew where they were, until now. Hannah quickly scanned the room. She needed to hide them, again, somewhere safer. But as she moved toward the attic stairs to put everything back, her son's voice startled her. "Mom?" She turned. Lucas stood by the front window, his brow furrowed. "There's a black car outside. It just passed again." Her blood ran cold. "What kind of car?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "I don't know. Big, like a government car. That's the 3rd time it's gone by." Hannah walked quickly to the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. Sure enough, a black SUV crept past the house at a crawl, then continued down the dirt road. She didn't recognize it. There were no plates. She moved fast after that, shoving the tapes back into the box, locking it, and slipping it into the bottom of the old flour bin beneath the kitchen sink. It wouldn't pass as hidden from a real search, but it might buy her time. She locked the doors, closed all the curtains, and told Lucas to stay away from the windows. Then she sat at the kitchen table, heart pounding, staring at her laptop screen. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. She could email someone, a journalist, a lawyer. But what if they were watching already? Number not yet. Instead, she pulled the manila folder back out and flipped it over. Scrawled in fine cursive on the back flap, barely visible in the fading light, were 5 words. The truth sleeps below bells. Her breath caught, the same phrase or close to it that ended Margaret's journal. The truth lies beneath the bell that no longer rings. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she could feel something shift inside her. A thread had been tugged and the entire fabric of her world was about to unravel. And somewhere out there, someone knew she had started pulling. The next morning, the sky hung low and gray over Doylestown, and the air smelled like wet iron. Hannah hadn't slept. Her fingers ached from transcribing fragments of Margaret's journal, and her eyes burned from staring too long at faded ink and yellowed pages. But it wasn't exhaustion that buzzed in her chest. It was the discovery sealed in the steel box beneath her kitchen floor. The reel-to-reel tapes. The memo titled Gulf of Tonkin Strategy. It was all too real and too big. By 9 a.m., she'd packed everything into a canvas bag, wrapped the tapes in old t-shirts, and locked Lucas's hand gently into hers. She told him they were going on a little drive, someplace quiet, someplace safe. He didn't ask questions. His eyes were wide, serious in the way children sometimes became when they sensed the grown-ups weren't pretending anymore. They drove 15 miles north to an old A-frame cabin tucked into a line of spruce trees on the outskirts of town. It belonged to Frank Delaney, a man Hannah hadn't spoken to in over 5 years, not since she'd organized a panel on Cold War intelligence for her AP history class. Frank had been the guest speaker. Back then, he'd struck her as somewhere between brilliant and haunted, a man who spoke too softly but thought too loudly. She knocked. It took a full minute before the door creaked open. Frank Delaney hadn't changed much. His salt and pepper beard was longer now, and he wore flannel over a tattered NASA t-shirt, but the eyes were the same clear, watchful, and unblinking. "Hannah Prescott," he said with a weary smile. "Didn't think I'd see your face again unless it was on a lecture poster." "I need your help," she replied, "and I need you to promise you'll keep it off any poster." She stepped inside. Lucas sat quietly in the corner, flipping through a copy of Popular Mechanics from the 70s. Frank motioned for Hannah to follow him to a back room, cluttered with radios, cables, and a wall of filing cabinets stamped with dates and red labels. She set the steel box on the table, her palms damp. Frank opened it without a word. When he saw what was inside, the lines around his mouth tightened. "Where did you get these?" he asked, voice low and flat. Hannah gave him the short version. Margaret Whitlow, the journal, the floorboard, the memo. She watched his expression shift from disbelief to concern, then finally to a kind of grave resolve. "These are government-issue Scotch 111 reels," he muttered, turning one over carefully. "Used from 64 to 69. And this..." He pulled out the memo. His hands trembled slightly. "This header format was retired in late 68. You know what this means?" "Some of it," Hannah said. "I was hoping you'd fill in the rest." Frank read the memo again, aloud this time. The words sounded heavier in his voice, like a confession recited in a courtroom. "Per strategic directive, ensure field reports align with public communication schedule. Naval incidents in Gulf should be presented as enemy provocation, regardless of factual ambiguity." He stopped. "This isn't just history. This is a playbook for war manipulation. This is the Gulf of Tonkin incident being scripted." Hannah sat down hard on the wooden bench, the air knocked out of her. "So, it's real?" "It's real, and it's radioactive," Frank said. "You understand the kind of fire you're holding?" "I'm starting to," she replied quietly. He sat opposite her and tapped the metal box. "If you go public, there's no going back. This isn't some dusty artifact to display in a school cabinet. This is evidence, and the people who kept this buried, they didn't just forget. They erased." She nodded, trying to steady her breath. "Then help me understand what they erased." Frank exhaled, then disappeared into the adjoining room and returned with a vintage reel player, dusty but intact. He threaded the first tape with the care of someone handling a live wire. When he hit play, a low hiss filled the room, followed by silence. And then voices, male, confident, conversational, but tight with subtext. "As long as we frame it correctly, the American people will never question the escalation." A pause. Another voice higher, colder. We can't afford the press sniffing around. If we say it was torpedoes, then it was torpedoes. The footage will follow. Frank clicked stop. The silence afterward felt like a vacuum. These are senior voices, he said. Not aides. These are policy shapers. Possibly Bundy. Maybe even Clifford. Hannah leaned forward. And if I release this? Frank's jaw tensed. Best case, you're smeared, buried in lawsuits, accused of fabricating it all. Worst case. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Lucas peeked in through the door just then, his small face pale. Mom, there's a weird car parked down the road. Frank stood. Stay here. Don't touch anything. He disappeared toward the front porch. Hannah crouched next to Lucas. What kind of car? A black SUV, he whispered. It's been sitting there since we got here. I think someone's watching. That night, Hannah barely slept. She lay on the couch in Frank's cabin, listening for the sound of tires on gravel or the crackle of a radio outside. Frank gave her a burner phone and instructions on what to do if anything happened to him. Keep the tapes, keep the kid, don't go home. And just like that, the countdown had begun. At precisely 6:03 a.m., the knock came again, harder this time, deliberate and unhurried. Hannah jolted awake on the couch, her neck aching from a restless night spent fully dressed, her heart still galloping from dreams of secret meetings and ticking clocks. The knock echoed through the old farmhouse like the beat of a war drum. She stood up slowly, wiped her hands down the front of her jeans, and tried to steady her breath. Lucas, curled under a fleece blanket in the adjacent room, stirred. Mom? He mumbled sleepily. Stay here, she whispered. Her voice barely cut through the rising static in her chest. She crossed to the front door and peeked through the warped edge of the curtain. A black SUV idled in her driveway, its chrome grille catching the morning sun. Another vehicle, sedan style, also government black, was parked nose to nose with her rusted Honda. 3 men stood outside in dark suits, the kind too sharply pressed for any civilian use, and one of them raised his hand for a third knock. When she opened the door, the man in front didn't bother with pleasantries. Ms. Hannah Prescott? His voice was calm but tightly wound, like piano wire stretched to its limit. Yes, she answered cautiously. I'm Agent Samuel Torres, U.S. Secret Service. This is Agent Miller, and that's Agent Cho. We're here under the authority of the Office of Protective Intelligence to conduct a national security compliance check. May we come in? The phrase national security compliance check was so absurdly sanitized that for a moment, Hannah wondered if she was still dreaming. Her mind instantly leapt to the box of reel-to-reel tapes, now hidden behind a loose plank in the back of the pantry. Tapes she and Frank had just confirmed were authentic White House audio from the late 1960s. I'd prefer to know more about what this pertains to before I let anyone into my home, she said, standing her ground on the porch. Her voice was steady, her legs were not. Torres pulled a leather wallet from his inside coat pocket and flipped it open. The badge gleamed, too pristine to be fake. We're here about recent property transfers in Doylestown tied to historically significant federal records. It's a precaution, Ms. Prescott. We just need to take a look around and ask a few questions. Behind him, Agent Cho was already looking past Hannah's shoulder into the foyer. It wasn't a request. Not really. Still, she nodded and stepped aside. Fine, but this is my home, and I expect to be treated with respect. Of course, Torres replied. The agents moved quickly, efficiently, splitting off into different rooms like chess pieces. Miller took the living room and hallway. Cho moved toward the back kitchen, brushing dangerously close to the pantry. Torres remained with her, clipboard in hand. Do you live here alone? He asked. Number my son's here. He's 9. Anyone else been staying here with you? No. Anyone else with access to the property? Not that I know of, Hannah answered. She watched his eyes scan the room, taking in every detail. The mismatched furniture, the half-unpacked boxes, the sagging beams overhead. Every creak of the floorboard sent her pulse skyrocketing. Then her eyes caught something. On the edge of the kitchen counter, barely visible, was the corner of Margaret's hand-drawn map. the one marked with 3 red X's denoting possible hiding spots around the property. Without turning, Hannah casually stepped into the kitchen, feigning a stretch. Cho looked up from the sink area. "Just grabbing coffee," she murmured, and with one fluid movement, palmed the map and shoved it deep into her sweater pocket. She tried not to flinch as she backed away. "We'll need you to sign this, Ms. Prescott," Torres said, holding out a folded document. "Standard non-disclosure acknowledgement under Title 50 of the U.S. Code. Until we finish our review, you are legally restricted from sharing any information related to what may or may not be found on this property." She glanced at the form, legal jargon, and threat of prosecution, neatly packaged in bureaucratic font. "So I can't even tell my family what's going on?" "Correct," Torres said. "This is a matter of national security." "And if I refuse?" He didn't smile. "Then we proceed with more formal measures. This is the less complicated route." Hannah signed. Torres pocketed the form. "Thank you for your cooperation." Just then, from upstairs, Lucas's voice carried down. "Mom, there are men in suits in the hallway." Torres raised an eyebrow. "It's fine, sweetheart," Hannah called. "Stay in your room." But Lucas didn't. He appeared at the top of the stairs, tousle-haired and curious. He held a half-eaten granola bar in one hand, blinking down at the strangers in their polished shoes and government-issued silence. "You're not robbers, right?" Agent Cho cracked the faintest smile. "No, buddy," Hannah said, trying to keep things light. "They're just here to make sure the house is safe." Lucas descended the stairs slowly, but Hannah noticed something different about his posture, the way he glanced at Torres with unguarded suspicion. When they'd spoken the night before, she'd told him nothing. But Lucas was intuitive in ways most kids weren't. Later that morning, after the agents had wrapped their search and left in a wave of black vehicles, Hannah found him sitting on the steps of the porch, fidgeting with a flashlight. "You okay?" she asked, settling beside him. He didn't look up. "I heard them talking in the hallway. The tall one said they only found 3 tapes, that the 4th is still missing." Hannah's blood ran cold. She hadn't mentioned a 4th tape to anyone, not even Frank. But Lucas was right. There had been 4 slots in the steel box. One had been empty. She reached for his hand. "What else did you hear?" "They said something about retrieving it before the press gets wind." "Lucas, thank you. You did good." He looked at her then, his eyes wide with questions. "What's going on, Mom?" She didn't have an answer. Not one a child should have to carry. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed and the house had fallen into a tense, uncertain silence, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's map spread before her. The 3 red X's still marked locations around the property, near the old well, under the rusted dinner bell, and at the edge of the tree line. She thought of the tape that was missing, the one the agents hadn't found. She thought of Margaret's final journal entry. The truth lies where no one dares to listen. And she realized what she had to do. They were coming back, and next time, they wouldn't leave without everything. She had to find the last tape first, and she had to do it now. It was just after dawn when Hannah and Lucas set out across the backyard, shovels in hand, following the creased, hand-drawn map that had been hidden beneath the floorboards. The morning was heavy with mist, the sky still dim, and the overgrown fields behind the house glistened with dew like glass. Hannah had memorized the X marks from the diagram, but one stood out more than the others. The spot labeled only with a faded word in red pencil: Bell. Lucas, still bleary-eyed and bundled in his oversized hoodie, trudged beside her. "What if it's just an old dinner bell or something?" "Then we'll finally get confirmation," Hannah said, tightening her grip on the shovel. "But if it's more than that, we're not coming back empty-handed." They stopped at a half-buried wooden post, jagged where the top had splintered off. It must have once held a bell, long rusted away. The soil around it was soft, undisturbed, but lighter in color than the rest of the earth. Lucas knelt and tapped a boot on the dirt. "Sounds hollow." "Let's dig." They worked in silence, breathing hard and sweating despite the morning chill. After 15 minutes, Hannah's shovel hit something solid. Lucas cleared the rest by hand, a small metal tin, the size of a paperback book, rusted at the hinges but still intact. She pried it open carefully. Inside was a microcassette and a folded note, edges yellowed and brittle. Hannah unfolded it slowly, heart pounding. Final recording. If the others are ever questioned, this one tells the full truth. There was no signature, just the initials M.E.M. W.W. Hannah stared at the cassette. It felt heavier than it looked, as though it carried more than just magnetic tape, as if it carried weight from another era, another war, another woman's risk. By the time they returned to the house, the sun had burned off most of the fog. Hannah made tea and scanned her blog, the one she'd kept mostly as a coping tool during the pandemic. A few days earlier, she'd posted about a mysterious political find in rural Ohio, without naming specifics. There was a new comment, just a username, RMJourno, and a message. I think I know what you found. I can help. I'm in Doylestown. Coffee? Rachel Monroe looked nothing like the journalists Hannah remembered from TV. No stiff suit, no clipboard, no booming voice. She wore jeans, a green field jacket, and boots caked in roadside dust. Her dark hair was in a messy bun, and a camera swung from her shoulder like a badge of authenticity. They met at a roadside diner on Route 57. Lucas was at home, watching cartoons with noise-canceling headphones. I used to write for the Capital Sentinel, Rachel explained after introductions, but I got tired of being told what not to print. So I went independent. I followed tips on suppressed history, war archives, black budget projects, hidden transcripts. Your blog pinged my radar hard. Hannah hesitated. She hadn't expected to be found so quickly. Rachel leaned forward, tone shifting. Look, I know what a microcassette looks like when it's been hidden for 50 years. I know what it means when someone signs with just initials. If you have something tied to Margaret Whitlow or the Johnson tapes, or even peripheral material on Tonkin, this isn't a local mystery. This is national. Hannah stirred her coffee in silence. Then she reached into her bag and slid the cassette across the table. Rachel didn't touch it. If I take that, I become part of the story. Are you ready for what that means? I don't know, Hannah whispered, but I'm not ready to bury the truth either. Rachel nodded. Then let's do this right. That night, as Rachel stayed over to help them organize the materials for transfer, Hannah stood on the back porch watching the woods. The stars had faded under low-hanging clouds, and the distant hum of crickets played the only melody. Then she saw it, a flicker in the tree line, the faint glint of glass, a reflection, binoculars. Someone was watching the house. She didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, she slowly reached back for the porch light switch, turned it off, and let the darkness swallow her. She had their attention now. The countdown had truly begun. The wind howled low across the fields of Doylestown as Hannah sat alone in the study, Margaret Whitlow's journal open on the desk before her. Her eyes lingered on one name, Eleanor, written in neat, looping cursive across multiple entries. Something about the way Margaret referenced her, protectively, even lovingly, had stirred a question in Hannah that she could no longer ignore. Eleanor Monroe, her grandmother, a woman who had rarely spoken of her past, who never mentioned a sister, let alone one involved in White House affairs during the most turbulent years of the Vietnam War. Hannah reached for the stack of old family photos she'd retrieved from the attic of her cousin's house months ago, before everything unraveled. She flipped through sepia portraits and creased Polaroids until she found it, a black and white photograph of her grandmother as a young woman, standing arm in arm with someone whose face bore an eerie resemblance to Margaret. The same determined chin, the same defiant spark in the eyes. She wasn't imagining things. Margaret Whitlow wasn't just a stranger from the past. She was family. Hannah's pulse quickened. It explained everything. The property's sudden auction listing, the faded label Bennett Whitlow Estate, on the back of a photo she once dismissed. She suddenly understood why the box of tapes had felt like more than just history. It was a legacy, hidden and waiting. She picked up her phone and called Rachel Monroe. Rachel had just returned from a trip to D.C., chasing leads on Vietnam-era intelligence leaks for her independent investigative site. She answered on the second ring. Please tell me you didn't dig another hole in your backyard. No holes, Hannah said, breathless. Just answers. Margaret was my grandmother's sister, my great aunt. She hid those tapes here not just because it was remote, but because she knew the land, the family. She trusted this place. There was a pause. "Holy hell," Rachel murmured. "You're not just preserving history. You are history. I need your help, and Frank's, and maybe people with the resources to make this bigger than a blog post." Within 36 hours, Hannah's kitchen had become a war room. Frank Delaney showed up with a box full of reel-to-reel equipment and a worn leather satchel he refused to let out of his sight. Rachel brought her laptop, portable scanner, and 2 contacts: Professor Helen Wu from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and journalist-turned-archivist Nathan Holcomb from the National Press Archive. Professor Wu, in her 60s, but with a wit sharp enough to make Frank raise an eyebrow, wasted no time. "We're dealing with tapes that potentially revise Cold War history. Whatever we find here, it's going to rattle cages." Nathan nodded, tapping through Rachel's digitized scans. "These aren't personal reflections. These are high-level briefings. If even one of these tapes holds water, it could reshape how future generations understand Johnson's administration." Frank unspooled the first reel and examined it with surgical precision. "There's oxidation on the edges, but the core's intact. We digitize, we document, and we duplicate. This doesn't leave here without redundancy." Hannah cleared a space on the table and pulled out the parcel she'd prepared the night before. Inside were labeled flash drives, copies of Margaret's journal, and a short letter she'd written by hand, addressed to M. Greystone, Washington, D.C. The recipient was a retired intelligence analyst who now headed a civil liberties nonprofit. Frank had vouched for him, one of the few people left from the old world who had gone rogue for the right reasons. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You trust this guy?" "No," Hannah said honestly, "but I trust that he wants the truth out more than he wants to protect a ghost." Rachel gave her a half smile. "That's good enough for me." As they prepared the digital backups, Nathan cautioned, "If the Secret Service returns, and they will, you need to have plausible deniability. That means you can't have originals here. Not anymore." They all nodded. Hannah handed the parcel to Frank. "Send it tonight, overnight express." By dusk, the kitchen lights were off. Everyone had dispersed. Rachel drove back into town under the cover of darkness to avoid suspicion. Nathan and Professor Wu left in separate ride shares to different motels. Frank promised to mail the package from a secure courier hub 2 counties over. Hannah stood alone at the kitchen sink, washing dishes in cold water, her hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but adrenaline. For the first time, she felt like she was no longer reacting to events, but shaping them. She had made a choice. No turning back now. At 2:11 a.m., a car engine hummed faintly in the distance. She moved to the front window, heart tight in her chest. A black SUV slowed as it passed the front gate, paused for an unnatural moment, then continued down the road. It didn't stop, didn't turn around, but it had seen the house. It was a warning. They were coming. The next morning, Hannah awoke early and burned the coffee on purpose, hoping the acrid smell would keep her grounded. Lucas wandered sleepily into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Did you hear a car last night?" he asked, voice groggy. Hannah looked at him and offered a small nod. "Yeah, I heard it." Before breakfast could be finished, 3 sharp knocks landed on the front door. Agent Torres stood outside, not in a suit this time, but in tactical gray, his expression unreadable. Behind him, 2 agents flanked the porch, one glancing toward the shed, the other scanning the field. They were searching before they even entered. "We need to speak with you again, Ms. Prescott," Torres said coolly. "I figured," she replied. "What's this about?" "We have reason to believe additional classified materials were removed from the property during our last visit." She didn't flinch. "I haven't left town." "I'm sure, but we need to look through the garden area again. And the barn." She swallowed hard, thankful that the tapes were long gone. "I haven't found anything else," she said, "but I'm sure you'll look anyway." They moved with military efficiency. Within minutes, 2 agents were sweeping the backyard, another searching the barn. One agent poked around the far tree line where Hannah had found the microcassette with Lucas. They weren't asking permission. This was pressure, applied subtly but unmistakably. Torres watched her closely as she stood on the porch. "Just so you understand," he said, lowering his voice, "this doesn't go away." People get hurt over things like this, reputations, families. You're threatening me? She asked. I'm reminding you, he said evenly, that not all history belongs in the public square. Hannah met his gaze. Margaret Whitlow disagreed, and I think she knew more about history than either of us. Torres didn't respond. He gave a brief nod to his team. Nothing here, one of them reported, just roots and hard dirt. They left as suddenly as they had arrived, and Hannah stood at the gate long after their vehicles disappeared, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. That night, she placed a call from a payphone 2 towns away, just as Frank had instructed. It's done, she said. The package is on its way. A raspy voice on the other end answered, Then history's about to change. And with that, she hung up, the weight of generations settling on her shoulders, but not breaking her. Not this time. This time, she was ready. Rachel Monroe was no stranger to government surveillance. After all, she'd spent a decade digging into corruption, misused power, and cover-ups that never made the evening news. But something about this case about Margaret Whitlow sent a different kind of chill through her. It wasn't just that the woman had gone missing. It was that no one ever bothered to ask why. She sat hunched over Hannah's kitchen table, the light of her laptop screen flickering against her tired eyes. Scattered across the table were pages of Margaret's handwritten notes, transcribed audio summaries, and newly digitized files from Frank's careful work. Rachel had come across a marginal note in one of the photocopied journal pages that stopped her cold. CIA presence confirmed at Union Station, likely tracking my departure. Tell E not to use the return address. They're watching post offices too. It wasn't paranoia, it was detail, names, locations, strategy. It was the voice of someone on the run, not from scandal, but from systems that fed on silence. Frank, she called into the next room, where he and Lucas were assembling real casings. He stepped in, his sleeves rolled, hands dusty with archival gloves. What is it? She slid the page across the table. This was written in December 1968, days after Margaret went off the grid. She knew she was being tailed. Frank scanned the note, his brow tightening. She names a handler. See here? MB, same man who briefed the Southeast Ops in '66. That lines up with what we suspected. This wasn't just a whistleblower running scared. This was a woman being hunted. Rachel exhaled sharply. We're not just dealing with history here. We're dealing with a legacy that powerful people never wanted unearthed. Just then, Hannah stepped in, clutching a plain envelope in her hand. Her face was pale. She held it between 2 fingers, like it might burn her. This came in the mailbox this morning. No stamp, just my name, nothing else. Rachel sat upright. Frank reached instinctively for a pocket knife and slit the envelope open on the counter. Inside, a single piece of paper, no letterhead, no signature, just a typewritten warning. You don't understand what you're playing with. This is bigger than any of you. Walk away while you still can. Lucas, standing behind his mom, read the words silently. Is it about Margaret? He asked in a whisper. Hannah knelt beside him. It's about the truth, baby, and sometimes truth scares people. That night, as the wind rustled the trees beyond the farmhouse and every creak of the floorboard set her heart jumping, Hannah couldn't sleep. She paced the hallway, thinking about the note, about the agents, about the recordings, about her family's hidden past. The moonlight cast long shadows through the uncovered windows. She paused by the dusty armchair in the far corner of the living room, the one she hadn't dared to sit in yet. It had belonged to Margaret. The faded upholstery, the wood trim worn smooth from decades of use. Something about it called to her. Almost absent-mindedly, she ran her hand along the seam of the cushion and felt something shift underneath. Her breath caught. Kneeling, she pried the cushion loose. It came up stiffly, the fabric resisting until it finally gave way with a sigh of old springs. Beneath it, wedged tightly in the wooden base, was a small cassette. Not reel-to-reel like the others. This was a microcassette, the kind used for voice notes and private dictation. There was a label, faintly written in blue ink. Record November 3rd, 1968. Heart racing, she stood frozen. It had been here the whole time, hidden beneath a piece of furniture, waiting. She called Rachel immediately. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in the kitchen, the tiny tape inserted into an old handheld player Frank had brought from his collection. Rachel hit play. The voice was unmistakably Margaret's, clear, calm, and urgent. "If you are hearing this, I didn't make it, not where I planned, not how I hoped. But you have the others. This is what they'll claim was a forgery. This is what they'll say never existed. This is the tape that proves them liars." Then came another voice, a male voice, gruffer, speaking in hushed but measured tones. "If this leaks before the election, we're finished. The peace talks fall apart. We spin it like Hanoi wasn't serious. Johnson stays neutral publicly, but we run interference behind the scenes. They'll thank us later." There was silence, then the sound of a chair scraping. "Get rid of the transcripts. If Margaret knows what's good for her, she'll keep her mouth shut." Click. The tape ended. Rachel sat in stunned silence. "This is it," she whispered. "They sabotaged the peace talks, lied to the public, used the war as a campaign tool." Frank leaned back, rubbing his temple. "And they buried it. Buried her." Hannah couldn't stop staring at the cassette in her hands. It felt warm, as if still pulsing with the danger and weight of its contents. Rachel straightened. "We need to go public, not a blog post, not a call to a journalist. We live stream it, all of it, with dates, names." "The works," Hannah hesitated. "We'd be painting a target on our backs." "You already have one," Frank said quietly. "Might as well give them a reason to aim." From the porch, Lucas called in softly. "Mom?" She stood and crossed to the door. He was pointing into the distance, toward the edge of the tree line. A flicker of movement, then a glint of glass. Someone watching through binoculars. They were no longer alone. Rachel stepped beside her. "You ready to tell the world what Margaret died protecting?" Hannah met her gaze. "We don't hide truth in armchairs anymore. We broadcast it." And somewhere, in the dark, the watchers took one more note. This wasn't going to end quietly. The morning sunlight cast long shadows through the curtains of the farmhouse, but it did little to warm the weight pressing on Hannah Prescott's chest. Her phone buzzed for the third time that hour. Another message from the blocked number, another ultimatum. "Failure to comply will be met with full legal action under the Espionage Act," the message read. She stared at it until the words blurred. There were no names attached, no official headers, just the stark threat laid bare like a trap in plain sight. Rachel stood by the window, her phone to her ear, whispering into it with more intensity than usual. "Yes, I understand. Can you get it verified by tonight?" "Good. Yes, encryption. He knows what to do. And keep your name off this. Please." Hannah looked up. "Was that David?" Rachel nodded. "David Marcus. He's still got connections at the Washington Ledger. He's going to get the audio authenticated, if we can get it to him without tipping off the watchers." Hannah let out a breath. "We have watchers now?" "Hannah," Rachel said gently, lowering her voice, "we've had watchers since the first blog post. The only difference is now they're getting bold." Frank arrived just before noon, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was unkempt, and his hands trembled slightly as he set his thermos down on the table. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "I picked up a tail in town. Military-grade SUV, unmarked plates, two men who knew how to follow without being seen, unless you've done this before." "Which I have." Rachel frowned. "You're being followed?" Frank nodded. "And not just me. I've been watching your perimeter cams, Hannah. Someone approached the back shed last night at 3:17 a.m. They didn't break in, but they left footprints, tactical boots, military issue." Hannah leaned against the kitchen counter, fighting the nausea creeping up her throat. "Why now? Why the sudden pressure?" "Because they know," Frank said grimly. "They know we're close to going public, and they're panicking, which means they'll get desperate." There was a silence, thick as storm clouds. Then Rachel broke it. "We need to secure the originals, now tonight. Somewhere they can't touch them." Hannah nodded slowly, pulling out a folded map from the kitchen drawer. She smoothed it over the table. It was yellowed at the edges and marked with several red X's. But her finger pointed to a circled symbol near the northern edge, an old church with a broken steeple at the edge of the family's ancestral land. It hadn't been used in decades. "This is the only place left that's not monitored. My grandmother used to say, 'No one spies on ghosts.'" They agreed to move the originals under the cover of night. Rachel would stay at the house with Lucas, creating the illusion of normalcy. Frank and Hannah would make the transfer. By dusk, the wind had picked up, sending dead leaves scraping along the porch. Hannah kissed Lucas on the forehead, her hand lingering on his cheek longer than necessary. "Don't open the door for anyone but me or Rachel, you understand?" He nodded. "Are you scared, Mom?" She smiled gently. "A little. But brave doesn't mean never being scared. It just means doing what's right anyway." Frank drove the old truck slowly down the tree-lined road. The box containing the reel-to-reel tapes, the microcassette, and the original memo sat under Hannah's feet, bundled inside a blanket. Every jolt in the road made her flinch. They arrived at the church just after 9 p.m. The building leaned slightly to the right, windows cracked, ivy growing through its foundation. But inside, the crawl space beneath the altar remained dry and untouched. Frank helped her bury the metal box beneath a loose floorboard. As the lid snapped shut and the earth was returned, Hannah felt something unexpected, calm. "It's in the ground," she whispered, "like a seed." Frank nodded. "Let's just hope it blooms before they try to rip it out." Back at the farmhouse, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, laptop open. Lucas had gone to bed an hour earlier. She was reviewing the timeline of files again when she heard something. A creak. Not from upstairs where Lucas was, from outside the kitchen window. She moved slowly, reaching for her phone and texting Hannah. Noise outside. Kitchen window. Seconds later, a soft thump echoed near the back door. Rachel froze. In Lucas's room, the motion sensor lamp flicked on. A shadow moved outside. Lucas, awakened by the light, did what Hannah had taught him. He pressed the silent alarm button she had installed beneath his bed frame. It triggered an alert on Frank's burner phone and Hannah's secondary line. "They're here," Hannah whispered, staring at the blinking screen. Frank floored the truck, gravel flying behind them. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the intruder was gone. But there were fresh boot prints by the window, and the back door's lock had been tampered with. Rachel and Lucas were safe. But the message was clear. They weren't going to wait anymore. Tomorrow wouldn't be a warning. It would be a strike. And as the sun began to rise behind them, Hannah realized the clock wasn't just ticking. It was counting down. The storm was almost here. The sun dipped below the Ohio horizon in a wash of crimson and violet, casting long shadows across the Prescott farmhouse. Inside, Hannah sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. She had spent the entire day in a haze, torn between fear and fury, uncertainty and resolve. At precisely 7:59 p.m., the screen lit up with a single message from a burner email account. "Live now. They need to hear this." Hannah tapped the link. The feed buffered for a moment before snapping into focus. No names, no faces, just a dark screen and a slowly spinning reel-to-reel tape. Then, a voice crackled to life. It was an old recording, unmistakably authentic, filtered through age, but intact. Two male voices, calm, confident, calculated. "We stall Paris. If peace talks move forward before the election, he wins. If they collapse, we control the messaging. That's not politics. That's survival." A silence followed. The weight of the words landed like a hammer. Rachel gasped from the other room. "That's it. That's the Paris sabotage tape. It's real. It's all real." Within minutes, social media lit up. View counts climbed into the tens of thousands. Journalists began tweeting fragments of the tape. Hashtags emerged: 1968, cover-up, Whitlow tapes, history exposed. By 8:20 p.m. CNN, The Washington Ledger, and even BBC World had broken into programming with late-night specials. Historians were called in. The word treason surfaced. Calls flooded Congress. Young people on TikTok dissected every sentence. Boomers wept, remembering the draft and the lies they'd been fed. And through it all, Hannah sat frozen, the walls of her house echoing with decades-old truths. At 9:13 p.m., her phone rang. "Ms. Prescott," the voice said, level but sharp. "Agent Samuel Torres." I believe you've seen tonight's events. Hard not to. We need to speak in person. Tomorrow morning, D.C. You want me to testify? Congress does, but I'm calling for a different reason. There's a way to protect yourself and your son. Turn over everything, all recordings, all documents. In exchange, we offer full immunity, protective custody. Immunity implies guilt, Agent. I'm not the one who recorded those tapes, but you possess them, and that makes you a legal liability. Hannah hesitated. And if I say no? A pause. Then we begin proceedings to compel testimony. Federal subpoena, search warrant expansion. You become the story, and you may not survive it. The line went dead. Rachel appeared in the doorway holding a laptop. The Ledger's editor just called. They've independently verified the voice print. It's real. President's aide, Secretary of Defense, a couple high-ranking names. This isn't just a footnote. This changes everything. Hannah stared out the window. Somewhere out there, people were waking up to a version of America they hadn't wanted to believe existed. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else. And now they know. She looked down at the old journal in her lap. Margaret's final words echoed like a bell tolling across generations. Some truths demand to be heard, no matter the cost. Tomorrow, Hannah would go to Washington, but she wouldn't go in silence. By the time Hannah stepped outside with her morning coffee, the air felt heavier than usual. Her porch, once quiet and ignored, had turned into a stage under invisible lights. Journalists had begun piecing together the mystery surrounding the viral recordings released days earlier, and whispers of the woman from the $1,000 farmhouse were spreading faster than Hannah could keep up. No one had said her name aloud on TV yet, but the pressure was mounting like a storm forming silently on the edge of the horizon. She caught her reflection in the kitchen window, tired eyes, tousled hair, and the weight of decisions pressing down on her shoulders. She glanced over her shoulder and saw Lucas still asleep on the couch, his favorite blanket pulled up to his chin. It wasn't fair. He didn't ask for any of this. He deserved peace, not proximity to scandal. By noon, she had made the call. I think it's time, she said to her sister over the phone. Can Lucas stay with you for a while, just until this settles? There was no hesitation. Pack his things. I'll meet you halfway. The drive to Columbus was quiet. Lucas sensed the tension, but didn't ask many questions. He hugged her tightly at the gas station parking lot, his face pressed into her jacket. Don't forget to text me every night, he mumbled. Promise, she whispered. That night, alone in the creaking farmhouse, Hannah noticed it for the first time. A black SUV parked across the road with no plates. Its windows were tinted dark, its engine silent. It didn't move, not once. She closed every curtain and checked the locks twice. Her mind spun with paranoia. Was it government surveillance, a private agency, or worse, someone neither official nor legal? She tried calling Frank, but got voicemail. Then she tried again, and again. Nothing. Frank had been off-grid before, but never like this. He always answered her texts, even if late. Rachel called around midnight. They took my laptop, she said without preamble. I came home and they were waiting. No warrant, just intimidation and veiled threats. Are you okay? Shaken, but alive. They're scared. That tells me we're close. The next morning, a news segment aired, suggesting the woman behind the leaked tapes was a single mother from Doylestown who had recently purchased an abandoned farm. They showed blurred images of a woman exiting the courthouse weeks earlier. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. Her name would be public soon. They were coming. She sat at the kitchen table, Margaret's journal open beside her, a cup of untouched tea slowly growing cold. There were only two choices now: disappear quietly, let history be reburied, or finish what Margaret had started, knowing it might burn everything in the process. She thought of Lucas, of the way he had said goodbye, of Rachel's pale, furious face, of Frank, who might already be gone because of her, of Margaret Whitlow, whose voice still echoed on brittle reels of tape, begging for truth to matter. Hannah folded her hands tightly and stared out the window toward the SUV that still hadn't moved. You want a show? She muttered. You're about to get one. And with that, she reached for her phone and began typing, a new blog post. A new live stream announcement. A reckoning. It was still dark when Hannah stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse, but the air had changed. There was a tension in the breeze, the kind that came before a thunderstorm or a reckoning. She stood quietly, sipping her coffee, eyes scanning the early morning setup. Camera crews were positioning tripods. Volunteers from Doylestown and surrounding towns were stringing banners between the trees and running extension cords across the ground. Rachel was already on site, checking the live stream feed from a makeshift control station under a canvas tent. The countdown had begun. This wasn't just another press conference. It was the moment Margaret Whitlow had preserved her whole life for, and it was the moment Hannah Prescott had spent months risking everything to make real. By 9 a.m., the lawn was filled with more than just curious locals. Students from Ohio State University, journalists from international media outlets, and historians from as far away as California were making their way to the once-abandoned farm. Every seat under the oak tree canopy was occupied. Dozens more stood along the perimeter. Satellite news trucks lined the dirt road leading up to the house. Even as Agent Torres and his team loomed at a distance, visibly displeased but constrained by the media presence, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Rachel stepped to the microphone first. "We are here today not just as journalists or academics, but as citizens," she began. "What you're about to hear is not conspiracy. It's not fiction. It's history that was buried, and thanks to Hannah Prescott, it is now unearthed." Hannah took a deep breath and joined her at the podium. The sun had begun to rise behind the trees, casting golden light across the gathering. "My name is Hannah Prescott. I was a high school history teacher until budget cuts ended that part of my life. When I bought this farmhouse for $1,000, I didn't know what I was walking into. I only knew that I couldn't afford to be afraid of the past." She paused, letting her words settle. Cameras zoomed in, phones lifted. The live stream ticked into the hundreds of thousands of viewers. "What I found in this house wasn't just old furniture and broken memories. It was the truth, hidden by a woman who risked everything to preserve it." Margaret Whitlow, my great-aunt, worked in the White House under President Johnson. She recorded conversations that revealed a systematic effort to mislead the American people about the Vietnam War. She wasn't a traitor. She was a patriot in the truest sense of the word. Rachel cued the first clip. Through a hidden speaker system, a cleaned and digitized reel-to-reel recording echoed over the fields. The voices were unmistakable. High-level officials discussing how to manipulate press narratives, delay peace talks in Paris, and protect the administration's political capital before the 1968 election. There was laughter in the background, the casual ease of people deciding the fates of thousands. Gasps rose from the crowd. Some sat in stunned silence. Others whispered as if unable to believe what they were hearing. Then came the second clip, followed by images of the original tapes, the White House memo marked confidential, and the transcription key in Margaret's handwriting. Historians on the panel nodded gravely as each piece of evidence was displayed. They confirmed the authenticity. They named names. By the time Rachel rolled the final clip, showing the microcassette discovered by Lucas and referencing the final conversation, even the press had stopped scribbling in their notebooks. They were simply watching. Hannah stepped back up. "I didn't come here to be a whistleblower. I came here because I believed in the value of truth." Margaret didn't run from the truth. She ran toward it, and she trusted someone would finish what she started. Today, we honor that trust. The broadcast went viral within the hour. Networks that once passed on the story scrambled to cover it. Hashtags trended globally. The Whitlow tapes, Truth Unearthed, Margaret's legacy. Within 48 hours, members of Congress issued statements. The House Oversight Committee voted unanimously to open a formal investigation into the tapes. On the fourth day, a joint resolution passed ordering the declassification of all Vietnam-era intelligence materials between 1967 and 1969. Agent Torres returned to the farm once more, this time without a warrant or threats. He offered no apology, only a nod of acknowledgement. "You changed the narrative," he said quietly. "Not many do." The following month, with donations pouring in and support from state preservation groups, the farmhouse was officially renamed the Margaret Whitlow Center for Historical Truth. Its mission: to educate, preserve, and champion untold histories. The attic where the tapes were found became an exhibit. The kitchen floor, still bearing the outline where the steel box had been hidden, was preserved under glass. Hannah, after months of hiding, testifying, and battling systems far larger than herself, returned to what she had always loved: teaching. Every Tuesday and Thursday, school buses lined up along the dusty drive. Children filed into a restored parlor that now served as a classroom. On the chalkboard, under her name, Hannah had written a permanent reminder: history isn't what we're told, it's what we choose to find. And when she rang the old dinner bell mounted beside the front porch, it echoed clear and true, a sound that had once been buried, now ringing across the hills of Ohio for all to hear. The bell of truth. If you made it here, to the very end of Hannah Prescott's journey, then you already know this wasn't just a story about an old house or a forgotten journal or even the shadowy truth behind a war. This was about legacy, about courage, about what happens when one woman, backed into a corner by life, refuses to let silence win. Maybe you saw a little of yourself in her, in that quiet strength, in the fear she never let define her, or in the way she chose truth, even when it shook the ground beneath her feet. Because deep down, we all hoped that if the moment ever came, we'd choose the same. And maybe that's why stories like this matter so much, not just because they entertain, but because they remind us. The past isn't really past. It's buried, tucked behind floorboards, scrawled in the margins of old notebooks, and echoing in the voices brave enough to speak up, even decades later. If this story moved you, if it stirred something in you that's hard to name, leave a comment below. Tell us what part stayed with you. Tell us who your Margaret Whitlow is. Maybe it's a teacher, a grandparent, someone who stood for something when it would have been easier to stay quiet. We read every word. We remember every name. And if you believe stories like Hannah's should keep being told, stories about ordinary people uncovering extraordinary truths, then subscribe to our channel. Not just to support the work, but because the next story might be even closer to home. You see, this isn't the only farmhouse hiding a secret. This isn't the only family whose past was rewritten or buried beneath years of dust and fear. Across America, in old barns and sealed attics, there are more voices, more Margarets, waiting to be heard. We're already working on the next one. And trust us, you won't believe what's coming. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and most importantly, stay curious, stay brave, because the bell has been rung now, and once truth starts echoing, it doesn't stop. We'll see you in the next story.